In this lecture, I'm lumping chapter 19 and chapter 23 together because they've kind of got some overlap. And I know it's weird to end this unit with chapter 19, but I think it just goes a little bit better because chapter 19 really covers different people's contributions to evolution and how we understand it as it is today. And in the past, when I've done chapter 19 first, people get a little bit confused. And chapter 23 is really basically evidence for evolution. So here we go. So if you look at living things long enough, you tend to realize that there's a good fit between organisms and the environment that they live in. And you also notice that there's a great diversity of life, but also that living things have a lot of things in common. I think diversity of life is easy to understand because even humans, which are a single species, are pretty diverse. But the unity of life, like we all use ATP, we all have DNA, we all have the same genetic code, those sorts of things are what we're talking about with the unity of life. And those three things can actually all be understood through the kind of lens of evolution. Evolution is often described with the phrase descent with modification. And what we mean there is that species are really just descendants of ancestral species that are different from the modern day species. And we talked about this in a previous chapter when we talked about microevolution, but basically evolution is saying that a population's gene pool is going to change over time. So scientists and other curious people have always been trying to classify things. Aristotle viewed species as fixed and tried to arrange them on kind of a scale with increasing complexity with non-living things at the bottom, then plants, and then animals, and then human beings at the top. Carl Linnaeus, who you might recognize from the chapter where we talked about naming things in binomial nomenclature, he organized species into nested classification systems, which we've already kind of talked about before. Currently, our nested classification systems are domain, and then supergroup, then kingdom, class, order, family, genus, species. However, we've got more information now, so we've moved, past these, or we've expanded upon them. Some more people who are important for background, and I'm not really going to test you over people's names, but I want you to understand their contributions. So you've got George Cuvier, who is the father of paleontology. He looked at fossils, and that really helped us kind of get the groundwork for new ideas about classification of life. He noticed that older strata or older layers had organisms that were very different from present-day organisms, and he speculated that the boundary between different layers represented some sort of catastrophic event that destroyed many species. Then we've got James Hutton and Charles Lyell, who were geologists. James Hutton came before Charles Lyell, but they recognized that large changes could really result through cumulative effects of slow but continuous processes. Those things still happen today, so they're not saying catastrophic events are between every layer, but that we can have big results from small processes. So think about like the Grand Canyon and how long that took to form, and how really it's just a river wearing away little by little to get something like that. So another thing that I think is confusing to people is people think of just Charles Darwin when they think about evolution. However, that is not entirely the case. Other people had other ideas on how life changed over time and the mechanisms of that. Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, or just Lamarck, looked at the fossil record and living species and realized they were different. And he was really one of the first people to provide a mechanism to explain these changes. Other people thought that these things were happening, but they didn't have a way to explain them. So he explained them with the idea of use and disuse, which is like the idea that body parts that are used extensively become larger and stronger, and other parts deteriorate. So if you use it, you keep it, and it gets better. If you don't use it, it goes away. He also talked about the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So he thought that organisms could pass any of these modifications on to their offspring. Unfortunately for Lamarck, he did a lot of other things, but this is what he's remembered for. He's remembered for the mechanism to explain evolution that wasn't the actual mechanism. So these mechanisms are unsupported by evidence. In kind of a famous experiment, Weizmann took mice and cut off their tails and bred them together, and they produced offspring who had tails. It's not funny, but it is to me. But an excerpt from that research says that 901 young were produced by 5 generations of artificially mutilated parents, and yet there is not a single example of a rudimentary tail or any other abnormality in this organ. So why 901, right? 5 generations. That's quite a while. That's a whole lot of mice that he cut the tails off of. And, all the babies had tails because organisms don't inherit acquired characteristics. There's a little bit of controversy about this now, though, because we're learning more about epigenetics. And so maybe Lamarck got it a little bit right with regards to that, because with epigenetics, right, the environment can affect how your DNA is packaged, remember, and then that can be passed on. But generally speaking, people really kind of discredit Lamarck, and the way he explained it is not the true mechanism for how evolution occurs. So that brings us to Charles Darwin and the Voyage of the Beagle. This is the super short story on this. There's lots of interesting things you can read if you want to know more about the Voyage of the Beagle. But the short story is that in 1831, Charles Darwin took an unpaid position as a naturalist, and he took a 5-year around-the-world trip on the Beagle. They're famously known for going to the Galapagos Islands, but they went to other places as well. There's a map that you can see down there. They collected specimens of South American plants and animals, and Charles Darwin observed that fossils resembled living species from the same region, and that living species resembled other species from nearby regions. So Darwin didn't come up with his ideas on evolution alone. He was influenced by Lyell's principles of geology. He noticed the uplift of rocks on the coast of Chile following an earthquake, and inferred that similar processes could explain the fossils of ocean organisms that he found in the Andes. That trips really sparked an interest in the distribution of species, and in particular, when he was at the Galapagos Islands, he saw all kinds of organisms. He noticed lots of different finch species, and he saw marine iguanas and Galapagos tortoises, those sorts of things. And he, in particular, is famous for looking at these finches. And these finches are still studied even today. But he hypothesized that species from South America had colonized the Galapagos Islands and speciated on the islands. And he perceived adaptation to the environment and the origin of new species as really kind of a closely related process. And if we look over here at the different species of finches, I know we did the worksheet in class on them as well, but here's just a couple examples. There's a large ground finch that can eat larger seeds. There's a vegetarian finch that can eat buds. There's a cactus finch that can eat cactus fruits and flowers. And then there's woodpecker finches that eat insects. And these finches have different beak shapes. They have different songs, all kinds of things. And they are the result of a closely related species being swept over to the Galapagos Islands. So he didn't know all of that at the time, but he saw this huge array of life from the Galapagos Islands. So Darwin wasn't the only person who conceived the idea about evolution through natural selection, or natural selection as the mechanism that explains evolution. Alfred Russel Wallace also had that idea, and he conceived it independently of Darwin. He did fieldwork in the Amazon River Basin and in Malay, but he's usually not talked about as much as Darwin. In June 1858, Darwin actually received a manuscript from Wallace, who developed a theory of natural selection similar to Darwin's. And then in July 1858, Lyell presented Wallace and Darwin's work together to the Linnean Society of London. And then Darwin was like, oh, I better finish that book. So he finished On the Origin of Species and published it the next year. Wallace collected tons of specimens. The picture I chose for this slide is actually a picture that shows some butterflies in a particular species that he collected. The ones with the red dots are butterflies that Wallace collected. So the book On the Origin of Species, again, published by Darwin, but It explains broad observations about life. Again, it explains the unity of life, diversity of life, and the match between organisms and their environment. Although Darwin never used the word evolution in the first edition of the book, descent with modification was used to summarize his perception of the unity of life. So this refers to the view that all organisms are related through descent from an ancestor that lived in the remote past. So Darwin also bred pigeons. The pigeons pictured are not the pigeons he bred. They're actually Grand National Pigeon Show champions because they were the nicest pigeon pictures I could find. But anyhow, Darwin bred pigeons, and it was kind of a thing that fancy people did back in the day. And he kind of realized that if you can breed pigeons selectively in order to get this vast array of birds, and man, there's so many more pigeons on this website if you get bored. But if you can create pigeons that look this vastly different through a process called artificial selection, the same sort of process could occur in nature. So instead of humans picking which traits are going to be selected for, the environment could pick which organisms survive and reproduce, and that could modify organisms' traits. So the argument for natural selection, really there's two observations that led to two inferences. So the first observation is that members of a population often are going to vary in their inherited traits. If we look at that picture of the ladybugs there, at first you're like, oh, they're all ladybugs, they look similar. But if you look closer, you can see the number of dots are different, the size of the dots are different, and kind of so on and so forth. And even just the size and the color of the ladybugs are different as well. The second observation is that all species can produce more offspring than the environment can support, and many of these offspring fail to survive and reproduce. So those two observations lead to two inferences. First, that individuals that are well suited to their environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals, and the second inference would be that over time, favorable traits are going to accumulate in the population. So let's review which of these depicts how Lamarck thought evolution occurred and how Darwin thought evolution occurred. So in the first picture, we've got long-necked giraffes. Yeah, you try saying that. Long-necked giraffes evolving as generations of giraffes stretch their neck to reach higher and higher leaves. And in the second picture, we've got long-necked giraffes having more offspring than short-necked giraffes due to their competitive advantage and being able to eat more leaves, and then not all of the giraffes surviving and reproducing. So the first set would be Lamarckian evolution, which again is not supported. The idea that the inheritance of acquired characteristics, that's not supported, and the idea of use and disuse. So the second picture is more depicting natural selection. So some features of natural selection: individuals with certain heritable traits survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. So over time, natural selection increases the frequency of adaptations that are favorable in a given environment. And if an environment changes over time, natural selection may result in adaptation to these new conditions and may give rise to new species. So we've got all kinds of evidence for evolution that we're going to go over. And I stray a little bit from the book, although I try and keep it close here. But we're going to talk about artificial selection, the fossil record, homology, which we've talked about before, embryology, biogeography, and then just direct observation. So artificial selection, again, we talked about it before with Darwin and the pigeons, but people have been breeding plants for generations. An example of this is wild mustard is actually the ancestor of all kinds of plants. You've got kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, kohlrabi. All of those are selected for different parts of the wild mustard. So another really cool example of artificial selection is the fox farms in Siberia. So in this experiment, they selected the most docile foxes or most tame foxes, which at the beginning of the experiment were really just foxes that didn't bite like a gloved hand and didn't react aggressively to humans that approached them. So they bred the tamest foxes with the tamest foxes, and by the 10th generation, 18% of the fox pups were considered elite or most tame. Another cool thing about this experiment is they also bred the most aggressive foxes, so they could compare the ends of the spectrum. So they had the nicest foxes and the meanest foxes. But then by the 20th generation of breeding the tame foxes, the fox proportion that were elite was 35%, and today elite foxes make up 70 to 80% of that experimentally selected population. So that's pretty interesting, and I could talk about this for quite a while, but if you're interested, there's the book called How to Tame a Fox that goes over it in great detail. And it's not just about how to tame the foxes, it's about kind of the culture and the state of science in Soviet Russia in the late 50s and early 60s, which is kind of interesting there as well. I've got a YouTube video, and I can't really get it to play and record our PowerPoint the way I'm doing it, unfortunately. But in the video, in the first part, it shows the aggressive foxes, and then if you skip to around, I think, 2 minutes, it shows the tame foxes. And if you know anything about dog behavior, you'd probably notice that the tame foxes don't particularly look all that happy either with the strange guy who's filming them, but instead of reacting aggressively, they act very appeasing to him. So it's kind of interesting there. All right, so let's review. True or false? Individuals evolve. False. Populations evolve. Number 3, how is artificial selection different from natural selection? In artificial selection, humans are picking the traits, and natural selection, nature is picking the traits that are passed on. And then how are they similar to each other? Well, they both can change the proportion of alleles in a population, so they can both lead to evolution. So then, more evidence of evolution, homologies, which we've talked about these before, but homologies are similarities resulting from traits that were passed on from a common ancestor. So related species can have characteristics with underlying similarity that even function differently, but they're similar structures because they came from a common ancestor. So that's homology. We can also talk about comparative embryology. So this reveals anatomical homologies that are not visible in adult organisms. For example, all chordates, including you, at some point in time have a post-anal tail. I have lost my tail. Vestigial structures then are kind of remnants of features that served important functions in the organism's ancestors. A couple examples of this would be pelvic bones in whales and boa constrictors. They don't have legs, so they don't really need a pelvic girdle to attach legs to. Although sometimes vestigial structures can be a little bit controversial because the whale's pelvis has an important role in mating. In humans, the tailbone and the muscles to wiggle our ears are often argued as vestigial structures. If you ever injure your tailbone, though, you will be pretty unhappy about that. And who knows, maybe being able to wiggle your ears at a party might just confer you some sort of mating advantage, or access to better seating or better drinks or something like that. But generally speaking, people would call those vestigial structures. Also, I scoured the internet to find you a picture of manatee fingernails. That is arguably a vestigial structure as well. There's some structures, though, that we think are vestigial that maybe aren't. People used to think the appendix was a vestigial structure, but it seems to have roles in repopulating your intestinal tract of bacteria. If, let's say, you have an awful case of diarrhea, you've still got this little area in your appendix that has your good gut bacteria, so that can repopulate the rest of your intestinal tract. So that is vestigial structures. So convergent evolution then is when organisms evolve similar or analogous features, even though they're not closely related. So these structures did not come from a common ancestor with a structure. So different species from different lineages have similar characteristics because they occupy the same sorts of environment, or they're under the same sorts of selective pressures. So if we have a shark, a penguin, and a dolphin, these organisms all have to be able to make it through the water. So they have this sort of torpedo-shaped body because that torpedo-shaped body reduces drag and is a good body shape to have if you spend your life in water, or a good portion of your life cruising through water. So the fossil record is more evidence for evolution. The fossil record provides evidence of the extinction of species, the origin of new groups, and even changes within groups over time. True fossils are formed only under certain conditions. They have to be buried in the sediment, the calcium in the bone needs to mineralize, the surrounding rock needs to harden, and then it has to remain undisturbed until found. So this is not necessarily something that happens all the time. So the fossil record, though, can document life's history. It reveals changes in the history of life on Earth, and we can see that past organisms were very different from those that are alive now. The fossil record is excellent at showing evidence of macroevolution, which are those broad changes above the species level, so the changes that separate gene pools. For example, we can see the emergence of terrestrial vertebrates, so land-dwelling critters with a backbone. We can see mass extinction events, and we can also see things like the origin of flight in birds. So the fossil record does have some biases. The fossil record indicates that there have been great changes in the kinds of organisms on Earth at different points in time, but few individuals have fossilized, and even fewer of those have been discovered. So the fossil record is kind of biased in favor of species that existed for a long period of time, were abundant and widespread, and had hard parts. If they had hard parts, we're likely to find them intact. If they were abundant and widespread or existed for a long period of time, there's simply more of them, so the chance that some of them form fossils is going to be greater. So dating rocks and fossils is important. We can get relative ages by looking at the different sequences in the rock strata or the layers. We can also get dates by radiometric dating. In this case, a parent isotope is going to decay to a daughter isotope at a constant rate. Remember, isotopes are atoms that have the same number of protons but a different number of neutrons. So we're going to lose neutrons there. So each isotope has a known half-life, which is the time required for half the parent isotope to decay. And then radiocarbon dating can be used to date fossils up to 75,000 years old. For older fossils, some isotopes can be used to date volcanic rock layers above and below the fossils. So here's just a graph showing you the time and half-lives and the remaining amount of the parent isotope and the accumulation of the daughter isotope. So that changes over time. And honestly, I'm not going to ask you to radiocarbon date anything, but I just wanted to sort of talk you through that. So there's major boundaries between different geological divisions that correspond to different extinction events in the fossil record, and I'm not going to make you memorize those, but I just want you to kind of be aware of that. So extinction and speciation kind of go together. The history of life on Earth has seen the rise and fall of many different groups of organisms, and this reflects the differences in speciation and extinction rates. So let's review. How is the fossil record going to be biased? What kind of critters are we going to find more of in the fossil record? So things that were widespread, things that were numerous or abundant, things that lived a long time, and then also things that had hard parts. And then this hopefully should be a review. What is speciation? Hopefully you saw the formation of a new species. So the fossil record shows that most species that have ever lived are now extinct. Extinction can be caused by changes to a species' environment, and at times the rate of extinction has increased dramatically and caused mass extinction events. So that's usually the result of disruptive global environmental changes, and in each of the 5 mass extinction events, 50% or more of marine species became extinct. So here's a chart that shows you different mass extinction events and kind of compares that with the diversity of life. This can be a little bit tricky graph to read because you've got like two lines going on and you've got three axes that are labeled, and it's kind of a mess. But if we look at the y-axis on the left-hand side, it's got a little red line. So the red line tells us the total extinction rate in families per million years. And on the right side, y-axis, we have number of extant families with the blue line there. Notice too that the red line and the blue line are at, what are they? They're both families, but they have different scales. So that's important to realize there. Then on the bottom, we've got the era period and the time in millions of years ago. So if you look on the graph, you can see there's a couple different periods where the total extinction rate spiked pretty high there. And then you can also see that the number of extant or living families is going to increase sometimes after that extinction period. So some people say that we're in a sixth mass extinction period because our current rate of extinction is estimated to be 100 to 1,000 times the typical background extinction rate. Extinction rates tend to increase when global temperatures increase, and data suggests that the sixth mass extinction event is being caused by humans, or it will be caused by humans if we're not already in it, unless some dramatic action is taken. Mass extinction often alters ecological communities and the niches available to organisms. A niche is like how a species makes a living. So if we wipe out half the species in an area, that's really going to alter like the feeding groups and the habitat and all kinds of things. So the type of organisms residing in a community can change with mass extinction, and it can take 5 to 100 million years for that diversity to recover. So let's talk about biogeography. This is another example of evidence for evolution. So bio, life, geography, I don't know, what do you think of when you think of geography? Most of the time students say maps and stuff, right? So geographical distribution of things that are living or extinct is what biogeography is talking about. So some things that we can see with biogeography is that isolated continents and island groups have evolved their own distinct plant and animal communities. We can also see that the evolution of major animal groups has correlated with the known changes in the distribution of land masses on Earth. So plate tectonics says that the Earth's crust is composed of plates floating on Earth's mantle, and the tectonic plates are going to move slowly through the process of continental drift. So oceanic and continental plates can separate, slide past each other, or collide, which can cause mountains and islands and earthquakes. And this pattern of distribution of land masses is related to biogeography. So plate tectonics kind of goes along with that. So here's Earth's major tectonic plates. I do not care that you memorize these, but I just wanted to show them to you. So that brings us to endemic species. Endemic species are only found in one particular region. They're not found anywhere else in the world. Not like all the endemics live in like Australia, but more like species that are found in Australia are endemic to Australia because they're not found in other places. So islands have many endemic species that are often closely related, and they're also closely related to species on the nearest mainland or even the nearest island. So species on islands give rise to new species as they adapt to the new environments. So that brings us to adaptive radiations. The evolution of many diversely adapted species from a common ancestor is what adaptive radiation is. So this figure on the right hand side is Hawaiian honeycreepers. They've descended from a common ancestor, but all have different bill shapes and different food sources and make use of different niches in their habitat. Adaptive radiations often follow things like mass extinctions. They follow the evolution of novel characteristics and also the colonization of new regions. So there's some notable adaptive radiations, including photosynthetic prokaryotic organisms. Thanks for the oxygen, guys. Also large predators in the Cambrian period, land plants, insects, and tetrapods, and in particular, mammals underwent an adaptive radiation after the extinction of terrestrial dinosaurs. So this little figure is just showing monotremes, which are your egg-laying mammals, marsupials, which are your pouch-having mammals, and eutherians, which are your placental mammals. So, as far as consequences of continental drift go, the formation of the supercontinent Pangaea about 250 million years ago had many effects. It deepened ocean basins, it reduced shallow water habitat, and it produces a colder and drier climate inland. And then separation of these land masses led to allopatric speciation, right, which is creating a species with a geographic barrier. Arguably, oceans, pretty big, would count as geographic barriers. And the distribution of fossils and living groups really reflects this historic movement of the continent. So this is really kind of tying back to biogeography again. So more evidence of evolution, we can actually observe evolution happening now. So our book calls it Direct Observations of Evolutionary Change, and I like to think of it as evolution is happening now! ! So I think lots of students think evolution is something that happened in the past, like, okay, we've got a giraffe, we've got an elephant, we've got a rhinoceros, they're all different, but now they're going to stay exactly how they are. But that is not true. We can still see evolution happening today. So two examples that our book gave to provide evidence for natural selection is natural selection in response to introduced species and drug-resistant bacteria. So, the introduced species example, soapberry bugs feed on seeds within fruits, and they feed most effectively when their beak or mouth part length is similar to the depth of the seeds within the fruit. In southern Florida, soapberry bugs feed on the larger fruit of balloon vines, so they have longer beaks. In central Florida, they feed on the smaller fruit of an introduced species called golden rain trees, so they have shorter beaks. So there's the picture of the short-beaked one feeding on the little golden rain tree fruit, which is the non-native species, and the long-beaked one feeding on the balloon vine, which is the native species. So if we looked at results of people who actually measured the beaks of these species, we've got number of individuals on the y-axis and then beak length in millimeters on the x-axis. There's little arrows that show you the average beak length in museum specimens. And if you look, you can see the ones that are feeding on the balloon vine, so the bigger fruit, tend to have longer beaks, and the ones that are feeding on that introduced species tend to have shorter beaks overall. So another example of direct observation would be drug-resistant bacteria. So Staph aureus is a bacterium that's commonly found on people's skin or in their nasal passages, but strains of Staph have developed resistance to methicillin. They developed this resistance 2 years after methicillin was first widely used. So when exposed to methicillin, the methicillin-resistant Staph strains, or MRSA, are more likely to survive and reproduce than the non-resistant Staph strains. And so what's going to happen is we will have a population that has more of the resistant members and fewer of the non-resistant members. Methicillin works by inhibiting a protein used in the building of the cell wall in the bacteria. So these organisms that are not resistant will die. The ones that are resistant survive and reproduce, and now we have more resistance genes in the population. There's more to it than this, but this is kind of the big picture. So now these methicillin-resistant Staph, or the MRSA strains, are pretty dangerous pathogens because we have to use alternative antibiotics. So there's some things that people tend to get wrong when they think about natural selection, and I couldn't decide what to call this. I wanted to call this slide misconceptions or I don't know, common mistakes or something like that. I went with highlights in scare quotes. So hopefully that makes sense to you. But natural selection does not create new traits. It actually selects for traits that are already present in the population. So natural selection can only increase or decrease heritable traits that vary in a population. It can't make new traits. And natural selection does not involve organisms trying to adapt to a particular environment. There's a link down at the bottom of this that has a link to UC Berkeley, and they have a great website on common misconceptions of evolution and kind of how evolution actually works. But these are the two natural selection things that I see students making mistakes on again and again. So this next slide is the same sort of idea. Didn't quite know what to call it, but we went with highlights. These are the things that students tend to get confused on. So evolution is not a theory of how life began. Rather, it's a theory of how life changes over time. How life began is abiogenesis. We talk about that in 170. If you have to take that class, I can talk to you then, or I can talk to you whenever if you want to ask me. Or if you're curious, flip a few chapters ahead in your book, and it goes over that there. The next one, individuals don't evolve. Individuals can have mutations, but individuals don't evolve. Evolution is on the population level, so populations evolve over time. Another one is that natural selection is not the only mechanism of evolution. So people think only natural selection leads to evolution, but since evolution is just a change in the proportion of alleles in a gene pool of a population, any of those departures from the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium can cause evolution to happen. Also, most novel biological structures evolve in many stages from previously existing structures. For example, complex eyes have evolved from simple photosensitive cells independently in many lineages. So that brings us to acceptations. Acceptations are structures that evolve in one context but then become kind of co-opted for a different function. So this doesn't imply that like the organism created a mutation and that those structures evolve in anticipation of future use, but rather a structure became used for a different function or a different reason. So natural selection can only improve a structure in the context of its current utility. It can't really plan ahead. When we look at evolutionary trends, you have to be careful because extracting a single evolutionary progression from the fossil record can be misleading. I feel like this happens with the evolution of the horse a lot. People will talk about like the ancestral version of the horse, was a small woodland creature, and then you talk about the horse getting bigger and roaming on the plains and that sort of thing. Like modern day horse knew it was going to turn out like that from the ancestral version of the horse. So be careful that when you're looking at trends, you consider all of the fossil, even those belonging to extinct lineages. And evolutionary trends don't imply that there's some sort of intrinsic drive towards a particular phenotype. So let's review. Number 7, feathers initially benefited organisms by helping them retain heat, then were co-opted for display and later co-opted for use in flight. This is an example of which of the following? Is it A, adaptive radiation, B, allopatric speciation, or C, exaptation? So hopefully you said C, exaptation. Number 8, Lake Tanganyika, right, sure, has about 250 species of cichlid fish, which are highly diverse in terms of morphology, so structure, behavior, and ecology. These species rapidly differentiated from a single ancestor and now differ in traits used to exploit their environments and resources. This is an example of which of the following? Is it A, adaptive radiation, B, allopatric speciation, or C, exaptation? So this is actually going to be A, adaptive radiation. Remember that B, allopatric speciation, that is when you have speciation with a geographic barrier. Since these guys are all in the same lake, I would say that they did not have a geographic barrier leading to their adaptive radiation. So that was 19 and 23 kind of lumped together. So we gave a very brief history on the contributions to understanding of evolution by various people. I'm not so much worried that you remember the people, but I do think it is worth kind of giving you an introduction to them. Big picture from that was that Darwin was not alone, and Darwin is not the only one who thought about evolution, and Darwin is not even the only one who thought about evolution by natural selection. Then we talked about the mountain of evidence for evolution, including artificial selection, the fossil record, homology, embryology, biogeography, and then direct observation or evolution is happening now. We also talked about extinctions and speciation and adaptive radiations and exaptations. So that was 19 and 23.